Russia-Ukraine news. Why exposing U.S. provocations in Ukraine is crucial. I communicated via email with a researcher at a peace organization. While the United States shares some blame for the Ukrainian conflict, he believes that the vast majority of responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine lies with Vladimir Putin. He believes the United States should continue arming Ukraine so that it can defend itself against Russian aggression, but he hopes the United States will pursue a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Several compelling counterarguments can be made to the views expressed by that researcher. To begin, what exactly is meant by the phrase, vast bulk of the responsibility? Should we attribute 33% of the blame to the United States and NATO and 67% to Vladimir Putin? Does Putin carry the bulk of the blame? 90%? 99%? The researcher seems knowledgeable enough to agree that the United States is not blameless in this crisis, but he did not provide a percentage when I asked him to do so. These questions about blameworthiness can seem abstract and meaningless at first. However, their significance cannot be overstated. The same sort of questions can be asked about many wars, and they are frequently asked in courts of law. There is widespread agreement that both sides were to blame for World War I's stupidity, avoidability, and unnecessariness. That Germany and Japan were to blame for World War II, the last and possibly greatest, just war. Those leaving World War II behind. That the United States was to blame for Vietnam for being both unjustified and stupid. That they both shared a large percentage of the blame, over 50%? The best way to respond to a military attack, according to those who hold this view, is to refrain from using military force yourself. Returning to the subject at hand, the evidence suggests that the United States is largely to blame for the conflict in Ukraine. If I had to give a percentage, it would be at least 33%. Provocative actions include NATO's aggressive expansion up to Russia's borders, which includes backing the 2014 coup in Ukraine that toppled a pro-Russian government and supporting far-right, anti-Russian armed groups. The United States also stifled peace efforts in Ukraine before and after the invasion of 2022. American diplomats have been sounding the alarm about the dangers of NATO expansion into Ukraine for years. The United States will never tolerate similar military and political expansion by Russia or China on American soil. The United States doesn't even tolerate the emergence of pseudo-socialist countries in Latin America. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has even less justification than the many wars, proxy wars, and government overthrows the United States has initiated far from its borders. The United States sees the entire globe as its legitimate area of influence. Senior U.S. diplomats, journalists, academics, and secretaries of defense have all said that my above judgments about the United States' responsibility for the conflict in Ukraine are justified on the grounds that the United States provoked Russia in Ukraine. The US and NATO provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and many alternative media outlets and commentators have covered this story. This includes Common Dreams, Truthout, Antiwar.com, ScheerPost, The Intercept, Jeffrey Sachs, Matthew Ho, Chris Hedges, John Mearsheimer, Aaron Mate, Caitlin Johnston, Medea Benjamin, Nicholas Davies, Consortium News, and LA Progressive, to name a few. Numerous mainstream news articles published before 2022 confirmed the existence of neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine and the United States' support for them. Since the invasion, a few editorials in major publications, including the New York Times, have pointed out American responsibility for the situation in Ukraine. More and more mainstream publications, such as Harper's Magazine, see their recent article, "Why Are We in Ukraine?" have begun covering the story. Anyone familiar with American foreign policy would have to admit that the United States' actions in Ukraine gave Russia good reason to feel threatened. The United States has a lot of blood on its hands even if it is only 10% at fault for what happened. Russia wanted desperately to join the West after the fall of the Soviet Union, but NATO needed an enemy to justify its existence. NATO's expansion sparked the conflict that's now being used to justify the organization. The Iraq War was totally unprovoked, Noam Chomsky has said. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was almost certainly sparked by provocation. For the past 3 decades, numerous senior U.S. diplomats and policy analysts have been warning Washington that ignoring Russia's security concerns, particularly its red lines, no NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine, in Russia's geostrategic heartland, was reckless and needlessly provocative. So, you can see that I am not arguing that Russia's invasion was okay. It was illegal, like many other U.S. wars. As the aforementioned articles demonstrate, the United States is not without blame in this crisis. The peace researcher I communicated with online is to be commended for his desire for diplomacy and his willingness to admit that the United States isn't blameless. I told him that his push for diplomacy was doomed to fail unless he and others in the public, Congress, and the mainstream media recognized the full scope of U.S. provocations. U.S. backing for Ukraine is admirable if the conflict was caused almost entirely by Putin's aggression. In addition, I've stated that I don't think the United States should arm Ukraine. It's important that we find a diplomatic answer quickly. To continue the suffering and potential escalation, I have no interest in arming Ukraine. A ceasefire is what I seek. The point that must be made is that the United States wanted this war and kept it going, using the innocent people of Ukraine as pawns in a cold and deadly geopolitical chess game. In this essay, I've tried to dispel 4 myths about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The first myth is that all of the blame for a war, like the one in Ukraine, can be placed on one side. Instead, it's more common than not that blame is shared equally. Second fallacy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was completely unprovoked. It's embarrassing that major news organizations let the government get away with such a cynical lie. Third fallacy. Russia would be absolved of responsibility for the invasion if it were admitted that the United States and NATO had provoked the invasion. Related to the first myth. Myth 4. Attempting to end the conflict in Ukraine through diplomatic means has a good chance of success and won't expose U.S. provocations. The majority of Americans agree with President Biden and Congress's decision to arm the Ukrainian government and did not object when Congress increased the 2024 Pentagon budget to nearly $900 billion. If you include the secret fund for the war in Ukraine, the costs of the Departments of Energy and Veteran Affairs, and the interest on the national debt that is directly attributable to the military, the total military budget balloons to absurd proportions. The national debt, now at $33 trillion, and the opportunity costs of perpetual wars account for the vast majority of these costs. Remarkably, only 6 months had passed since the disastrous conclusion of the disastrous war in Afghanistan before the United States found itself once again at war, this time as a proxy with Russia. However, neither the mainstream media nor the majority of the public voiced any doubts about the justification for the war. Meanwhile, the United States is actively preparing for war with China, increasing tensions by sending high-level politicians to Taiwan, arming Taiwan, and enlisting countries like Australia to create a noose of military power around China. What are the risks, if any? As with Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other wars, proxy wars, and government overthrows, the United States lied to justify its involvement in Ukraine. A more reasonable military and foreign policy might be implemented if the corruption within the military-industrial complex were exposed.